go to the pub, they actually got paid in the pub. A lot of that money went into liquid food, which was often Guinness. Guinness eventually became an ingredient in recipes. In fact, it was sold as a health food in the 1920s and 30s. They gave free samples to doctors in return for testimonials. It was supposed to be really great for lactating mothers or people with a nervous disposition or people who couldn't sleep. Eventually, the recipes caught up with it, and it was used in lots of things, from porter cakes to chili to brownies. It was used with chocolate a lot. But one of our favorite recipes, of course, is a beef stew. So let's head into the kitchen with Julia and make one of my favorite beef stews, Guinness beef stew. You know, I've always said that all you need to be a good cook is 25 recipes. You probably agree with that. And one of them, the top 10, would be a stew of some kind, of beef stew. The problem is people go wrong on step one, which is buying the meat, which can completely destroy the recipe before you even get started cooking. If you go to the supermarket, you'll find stew meat. It may not be labeled round, but it is round. There's a lot of meat there. There are very few bones. It's easy to bone out and cut into pieces. It doesn't have much fat or connective tissue. It doesn't have great flavor. So with stew, you want something with a lot of connective tissue that breaks down slowly and makes the meat juicy and tasty. These are the more expensive cuts. They're far away from the horn and the hoof, which means they get less exercise, which means less connective tissue. Those don't need real long cooking. The chuck does, though. This gets a lot of action. The muscles are developed. It needs long, slow cooking, which is perfect for a stew, of course, and also gives you a lot of flavor. So start with the chuck. The other quick thing is that you really need to pay attention. A stew's not just throw everything together.
Right.
So if you do it right, it's great. If you don't do it right,
that's true. There's a couple steps you need to pay attention. Sometimes you see this generically packaged stew meat. It could be random cuts from all over that they throw together. Stay away from this because you just don't know what it is. You're better off buying your own chuck eye roast, and this is a 3.5 to 4 pound chuck eye roast.
I have a theory about this stew meat.
Do you?
It was the stuff on the floor.
Oh.
So I would definitely stay away from that.
Stay away from that. But before we start with the meat, we're actually going to start sauteing the aromatics. And this is 2 onions that are chopped fine. And in here I have 3 tablespoons of oil heated up. And we're just going to get these browning. I'm going to add a little bit of salt, and of course this helps draw out the flavor and moisture of the onions. And we're going to really get these brown, which will take about 10 to 13 minutes. And of course develop a nice fond browning on the bottom of the pot. And this is a little unusual for us. This is our new style of stew making. Traditionally you start with browning the meat to develop the fond. But what we found is that takes a lot of time, it's quite messy, and this is just more streamlined. You get a fond with the onions and the aromatics, and then you let the stew brown in the oven.
You're breaking with tradition.
I am, but this is just a little bit simpler. So here we have, again, our 4 pound chuck eye roast, and now we're just going to cut it into 1.5 inch chunks of stew meat. And how I like to do it is just cut it right away into 1.5 inch thick slabs. And so once I cut it into slabs, I'll just trim away any pockets of fat I see. But you don't have to go crazy here because the fat will really render out in the stew and you can take it out of the pot before you eat it, but it helps the meat remain tender. And of course I just take this slab and I slice it into strips that are about 1.5 inches thick. And then you can slice each strip crosswise into pieces that are nice and even so that they'll cook through evenly at the same rate.
We should mention one other thing, because a lot of people are probably thinking you're not browning the meat, you're not sealing in the juices.
Yes.
And we've actually tested that proposition in the kitchen. It turns out browning the meat has nothing to do with the juiciness of the meat. It doesn't seal in anything.
That's right.
So there is no benefit to browning other than developing flavor, but it does not seal in juices.
Not at all. And of course the meat will brown really well in the oven because again we're going to cook the stew uncovered. And that'll also let the Guinness and the broth really reduce and make a hearty, rich sauce. And of course I'm just seasoning this meat with a little salt and pepper. So let's go check on these onions. It's starting to look softened, and of course you can see a little browning happening around the edge of the pot. We just want a little bit more browning, and then we'll start adding the other aromatics. So you can see these onions have really transformed and they're much more golden and brown, and that will add a good, deep, hearty flavor to the stew. So now we're going to add a little bit of tomato paste, which is a classic ingredient to add beef stew, and that was just a tablespoon. And a little bit of garlic. This is 2 cloves of garlic. You want to stir them in the pot until you can really smell them and they're fragrant, and that tomato paste will start to brown a little bit, and that'll bring out its sweetness. You can also see that tomato paste really starts to make a nice fond on the bottom of the pot as its sugars stick to the pot and caramelize, and again, that's the flavor you want for what will become the sauce. So So now we're going to add a little bit of flour. This is 1/4 cup of all-purpose flour. It'll mix with the fat in the pot and make a roux that will help thicken the stew without being clumpy. And we're just going to cook this flour for about a minute or two until it starts to get golden and it looks like it's pretty much absorbed by all the oil left in the pot.
You know, I get to this point in a recipe like this, it always looks like I'm doing something wrong.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, you think it's a dry pot. It's starting to look really burned on the bottom. But this is good. This is how you make sure your gravy is thick but not lumpy, and then how your sauce has some really good color and flavor. So now we're going to whisk in the liquids, and this is 3 cups of low-sodium chicken broth. I always start by whisking in slowly to help dissolve the flour and make sure you don't get any lumps. This is also a good opportunity to scrape up any brown bits that are stuck to the bottom of the pot. And then I finish pouring in the rest once I have it pretty uniform in there. And you know, a lot of recipes we found for Guinness beef stew use all beer and no broth. And we found those just tasted incredibly bitter. You couldn't taste the beef, you couldn't taste anything. But Guinness, when it reduces down, just took over the whole pot and tasted bitter. This is just 1/2 cup. And of course, we'll finish with a little fresh Guinness at the end to reinforce its flavor without it tasting bitter. And you can see how nice and brown that sauce is, thanks to the browning of the onions and the tomato paste. And so now we're going to add just 1.5 tablespoons of brown sugar to help tame the bitterness of the Guinness, and then a little fresh thyme. This is a teaspoon of fresh thyme, and that is it. Very simple stew. And now we're just going to add the raw beef to the pot, and then we're going to cook the stew uncovered in that oven so that the sauce really reduces down and becomes nice and thick and flavorful, and the beef sticking out of the stew will actually brown.
So some of the browning